Hello and welcome. I'm Caroline Stockmann, Chief Executive of the ACT, and I'm here to tell you about the findings of our annual research, The Business of Treasury, as well as reflect on them in the context of the COVID-19 global crisis. Although the crisis really was only just emerging as our 200 interviewees shared their thoughts, the findings are really fascinating in light of what we see now, just a couple of months later. The title of the research is Changing World, Shifting Priorities. And the first part of that is still most definitely true, if not more so. As who would have thought we'd be where we are now a few months back? And shifting priorities remains a clear likelihood on one level or another. But we'll explore that a little further in this talk. So, we have about 15 minutes together to explore what is changing in the Treasurer's view, pre and post COVID-19, and where the priorities are shifting. First and foremost, when talking about what Treasury means to our profession, there is a clear consensus. Cash management and liquidity, and then financial risk management come top of the list. And of course, that positions the Treasurer in the centre of the current crisis to an extent that has never been seen before. Our treasurers are busier than ever as they focus on ensuring their company remains in business with increased cash flow forecasting, greater direct interaction with their boards, and consideration of new facilities and schemes offered by banks and governments around the world. We note that those who have really thought through business continuity planning and financial risk management previously, as one treasurer put it, having a general distrust of the system and planning accordingly, are doing better than those who, for one reason or another, did not take it seriously enough. In general, Treasury teams have made smooth transitions to working from home, and they've positioned themselves in liquidity terms in a way that allows them to identify, monitor, and mitigate the current stresses on the system. This applies to a greater and lesser degree, of course, according to industry. And there are some whose businesses have almost disappeared overnight, and for whom this is a deep shock from which it will take a long time to recover. But the message is clear. Focus on liquidity and financial risk management pays off. In terms of cash management, we see a far greater emphasis on cash flow forecasting, of course, since the crisis emerged, with increases in frequency as boards require weekly, if not daily, updates. Some organizations who are classically cash rich have been caught by surprise, as they never felt they needed to perform cash flow forecasts in the past, and it's a steep learning curve for them. And something not considered when going through business continuity exercises, in my experience. We tend to think about how to move our teams out of the office, often to another location, which of course isn't possible in a pandemic. And we look at disaster recovery plans in terms of IT. But we rarely look at what we would need to do around forecasting capability or setting up a line of credit when we've never had to do so before. Getting approvals on documents may prove untested when it comes to it. So looking at your governance framework and how agile it can become in an emergency is critical. Therefore, it's likely that some changing priorities will be seen going forwards as treasurers consider whether they are ready for the next pandemic, whilst liquidity and financial risk management will stay at the heart of that conversation. We see that the trend of treasurers being ever more strategic in their outlook continues, and that is reflected in their engagement with the board. And, surprise, surprise, the board has been most interested in talking to them about capital and liquidity management. We know that this has intensified over the last months, and those treasurers who have good communication skills and are trusted partners of their CFO and board will be the ones who are listened to and who can make a real and positive impact during these challenging times. An example has been the debate over drawing down on committed facilities, with many treasurers able to convince boards to take a longer-term view of liquidity facilities rather than draw them all down on day one. This requires determination and tenacity as well, as treasurers are having to return to this question every time they meet with their board. Communication skills stands out as a real priority for treasurers today, and we'll come back to that as one of the key changing priorities we have seen coming out of the 2020 research. The changes our treasurers saw affecting them then, and in the future, 2 or 3 months back, included technology. We see how, from an external perspective, they were worried about cybersecurity. And this is even more relevant during the crisis as cybercrime increases. Along with cybersecurity, automation was the other popular area, where treasurers saw further automation enhancing their roles so they can focus more on the strategic, value adding areas of the job, whilst the machine takes care of the boring or routine tasks. Internally, technology advances were a concern, and many we spoke to were worried that insufficient investment is allocated. However, in terms of views expressed by those who felt most strongly, there's a real split in opinion amongst treasurers on the importance of technology in the future and whether we are talking about current systems being upgraded and tweaked and that being sufficient, or at the other end of the spectrum, interviewees saying they expect massive change where they cannot even imagine the specifics, but know that we'll be working in very different ways over the next decade. Interestingly, the views are quite extreme, with very few sitting on the fence with this topic, certainly in the verbatim remarks recorded. However, overall, there is consensus that AI and machine learning do not figure high up on the priority list of investment for companies, at least not in the Treasury space, though they are a key concern. How will this change due to COVID-19, I ask myself. In all likelihood, talking to treasurers today, any investment that is not critical will be put on one side for the moment. A number of treasurers have paused TMS implementations, though I've also heard of others currently considering them, all relative to where they lie on the spectrum of sophistication in systems terms. Cash management, forecasting, and access to liquidity will drive the decisions here. And it will be a follow-on that people then start to focus on efficiencies and cost savings, both of which may imply a pickup in investment in technology. And of course, cloud-based solutions will have proven themselves as treasurers find they can continue to access critical treasury files and databases whilst working from home over a sustained period of time. Looking at the new normal, as we're calling it, we can see how important technology is for us all. And most of us are grateful that recent advancements mean many of us can work from home without issue. It follows that any developments which allow us to work more effectively at distance will be the focus, as people start to enjoy a different pattern of life without the commute. It doesn't suit everyone, but we had already noticed trends emerging, especially amongst the newer generation coming into the workforce, where more flexibility in terms of how to work was being demanded. That trend has been accelerated under current conditions, and it's unlikely we'll go back to a way of working as it was before. This is certainly backed by a recent survey by Gartner. Some of the really new and intriguing findings this year, which tie into the trend we've been seeing around strategic influencing skills, are the focus now and in the future on communications, relationship building, and change management skills. It's the leadership and strategic competencies, alongside people management skills, that treasurers feel they most want to develop in. And leadership is the area of most need for both themselves and their team, where they feel it is really holding them back in terms of career progression. We had a hunch a year or two back that this was the case, hence introducing various opportunities for our members to gain further insights into leadership skills, as well as incorporating this critical area into our Advanced Diploma in Treasury Management, which is our master's level qualification. We found through attendance levels at our various events, as well as feedback from them and on our qualification, that our instinct was right, and the business of Treasury research reinforces that view. But what does it mean for today and the current environment? Well, I can't think of any situation where leadership skills are more necessary than today, in whatever line of work you're in. The treasurer needs to be able to lead their board into making the right decisions. Enough liquidity, but not drawing down cash unnecessarily, for example, which can be a real challenge. They need to be able to lead their teams through a period of uncertainty and huge pressure to get things right, whilst balancing family, fears, and frustration. And they need to do all that while staying healthy and sane themselves. It's a big ask. But then the combination of skills and priorities we see in the 2020 research does suggest that today's treasurer is poised better than ever before to cope with this unprecedented set of circumstances. And we'll come out of it stronger on the other side. Whether in the UK or the rest of the world, more treasurers in 2020 are finding their roles varied and interesting than ever before. I imagine that has not changed much over the last months. Though we know from our conversations with many of you that you're now working longer hours than ever before, and it's exhausting. Many of you are saying you like the challenge, however, and it energizes you as you weigh up the options and take action to ensure your organization continues as a sustainable entity. And the fact that 90% of your organizations were taking mental health and well-being seriously, and that rises to 100% with larger organizations, means that you're well placed to look after your staff in an environment which can easily lead to issues for individuals and teams in this area. Talking to many of you on how you and others are coping, we know that this crisis for many is like nothing which has gone before, and a huge shock to the system initially. That applies not only to those just starting out in Treasury, but also to some of those who braved the global financial crisis of 2008. Dependent on sector and specifics, treasurers have different views as to which was or is the most challenging. But the large majority believe today's situation is the worst crisis of their lifetime, given the impact at a personal level as well as at a business level. The previous financial crisis was all about the banks, however, and thankfully, due to the reforms put in place over the last decade, the banking system is far more robust and ready to take on the stresses of the current situation. The research also looks at where funding comes from, and debt capital markets and bank finance are highest on the list. I wonder how this will look in a year's time. Dependent on government support, for which many treasurers are very grateful, we may see a shift here, possibly with a share in equity markets and other increasing relatively. But it's early days still. During the period of our research, the debt capital markets and bank finance, as I say, remained the largest source of funding for most businesses, with global markets awash with liquidity. Treasurers had benefited from a long period of low interest rate policy and a rise in available funding. In addition, the impact of quantitative easing during the last decade on the financial markets has been significant, with new concepts such as negative interest rates becoming a daily reality in certain countries. Post-crisis, the levels of government and central bank debt will be higher than most members will have experienced, and this will have impacts on domestic long-term interest rates. The structural implications may be profound, as government debt management potentially crowds out the private sector. Banks will have increased significantly their lending during the crisis, and this may restrict their lending appetite. What may be clearer is that businesses with strong balance sheets will continue to be able to access a range of funding sources, whilst others may find some or all of the debt markets harder to issue into. What we can say is that the focus on regulation, which had increased in 2020, most likely due to LIBOR transition concerns, will be put on pause over the next months out of necessity, after which it will resurge as regulators get a sense that the real economy is lifting its head from its single-minded COVID-19 focus. At the beginning of the year, 85% of organizations recognized the Treasurer as a strategic business partner. Almost half of treasurers are now directly involved in the creation of business strategy, with a further half consulted on it to varying degrees. I believe that the current crisis will mean that the perceived value of the treasurer only increases, and their seat at the top table is likely to be secured. This won't be automatic, but an opportunity to step up and use an appropriate mix of technical and soft skills, so to speak, to directly influence board decisions. Every cloud has a silver lining, as they say. One of the top skills of a treasurer who is balancing financial risk and opportunity on a daily basis is the ability to make decisions under uncertainty. Treasurers are trained in tools and analytical concepts which aid such decision making, and that's exactly what is needed in today's new normal. Whilst many treasurers tell us that their short-term cash forecasting has settled since the outset of the crisis and is now working well, they admit that the longer-term picture is, of course, much more uncertain, although they are well equipped to provide scenarios and ranges of outcomes, which is the critical need and the best anyone can do under the circumstances. Many treasurers, as said, feel that there is a need for further development of their leadership and influencing skills, and the current climate will have allowed them to take learnings on that front. We still see that sometimes treasurers are a little behind the curve in terms of where their boards are on diversity and inclusion and ESG. Again, the current crisis has thrown a bit of a spotlight on both of those, and I expect we'll start to see a more cohesive picture coming through in next year's research. In terms of ESG, and climate change in particular, the correlation between pandemic and reduced pollution is clear, and the feasibility of significant change is evidenced. This will surely have a positive impact on the road to carbon neutral footprint. Some reports are already flagging an increase in green finance activity, and boards are considering their options carefully as they potentially can turn a necessity, i.e., for raising funds, into an opportunity to push the sustainability agenda. As businesses restructure some or all of their activities, this provides them with the chance to look at it from an ESG perspective. And we know that investors are keen to fund ESG programs that reduce carbon footprints by, for example, building more fuel efficient buildings in better locations and investing more in working from home capabilities to reduce the commuting carbon footprint of employees. Treasurers will have the opportunity to assess investor demand and help shape internal conversations on business planning. And the social part of ESG is also coming under the test as organizations demonstrate their choice between a short-term win at great cost to long-term reputation versus the right choice, which will secure relationships for many years to come. People won't forget how they were treated when they needed help and support. And the stakeholder versus shareholder argument comes into sharp relief here. I'd like to come back to communications now. Around 70% of treasurers said that they needed to develop their communication and relationship building skills. And this is great evidence of both self-awareness and a focus on self-improvement. It's also the area which will make them stand out from their peers, as their colleagues and other stakeholders will not be experts. And the ability to make Treasury matters clear to them and to influence effectively when an important Treasury decision is to be taken is key. If we then move forward a few months to today, those skills will remain critically important as treasurers work to influence their colleagues and boards to do the right thing, whether in terms of liquidity management, funding sources, or indeed support of the extended supply chain. We know many of the larger group treasurers are supporting their smaller suppliers through shortened payment terms, for example, or indeed by helping them secure trade finance. And this is not only the right thing to do, but it ensures both viability of supply and an even stronger supplier relationship for the future. So, as I review the findings of our 2020 research, it is with a sense of pride in our treasurers. This is not only due to all they are doing currently for their organizations, working incredibly hard at the coalface of the crisis in terms of liquidity management, but also because of where they have positioned themselves in the past and where they continue to focus, but also shift in their priorities. Treasurers are used to being agile and responding to market changes, which makes them invaluable to their organizations in projecting a sense of calm whilst pushing onwards. Did they know that this pandemic was going to come now? No. Were they prepared for it? In a way, maybe, yes. Well, thank you very much for joining us. I hope you found that as interesting as I found reading the report myself. And I really look forward to you joining me for the rest of the International Treasury Week and all that it has to offer. Thank you.